Good afternoon, and welcome to the AFS Best Practices Leadership Council webinar. Our topic today is ESG and Sustainable Finance, Implications for Commercial Lending. This webinar will be approximately an hour long, and our speakers today are Lee Kidder, Director at AFS, and Dean Snyder, Executive VP of AFS. Before we get started, there are just a few housekeeping items. We are recording today's session, and therefore all lines have been muted. We do encourage questions, so please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions, and we'll leave some time at the end of the prepared remarks to answer your questions. Tomorrow, you will receive an email with a link to listen or download the presentation. Thank you for joining us today. Dean?
Thank you, Renee. Environmental, social, governance, you've most likely heard it, but what is it? The AFS Best Practices Leadership Council is pleased to present an overview of ESG lending, a definition, and its impact on commercial lending. Today, we have Lee Kidder, Director at AFS, to provide his insight on this very relevant topic. We expect this to be the first in a series of sessions on ESG lending, and subsequent sessions will provide more focus on how AFS can support this important and growing aspect of our business. Over to you, Lee.
Thank you, Dean. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, as the case may be, everyone. Welcome and thank you for tuning in. Today, we're going to be talking about ESG, environmental, social, and governance activities that affect the value and performance of companies, and how that activity gets correlated with financial decisions by investors and financial institutions. ESG is really an enormous subject. It's a lot more than simply climate change or inequality or diversity, as the topics, though important they all are just a small portion of the topics and issues that are affected by ESG. It's really become an umbrella term that can, it's become an umbrella term that can comprehend a large number of other related terms and issues, all of which have in common that they represent risks either to businesses, to economies, society, or the planet, and efforts that are underway to address them. They can include such things as climate change, global warming, carbon footprint, biodiversity, air and water pollution, racial justice, inequality, public health, human rights, education, and activities by corporations that represent their governance and strategy, how effective they are, how strategic their management is, and how effective they are in addressing these issues. And we get into the sustainable finance arena with socially responsible investing, sustainable finance products such as green bonds and loans, sustainability linked loans, and others. This huge list, by the way, is neither exhaustive nor exclusive. But for our purposes today, we're going to use the term ESG in the context of financing and investing in companies that are focused on ESG activities, and what the implications might be for banks and commercial lending. So what that means is that this presentation really is not going to be about what ESG is, except for a very brief review. It presumes that the term is more or less familiar to all of you. It's really about the objectives and challenges involved in efforts to standardize the way ESG activities are defined, measured, and reported, in order to be more relevant and useful to banks, lenders, and others that are making investment and financing decisions that incorporate ESG. So why is this so important now to the financing, the world of finance right now? Over the past 10 years or so, ESG has become a very central focus among global investors who have been demanding more and more detailed information about ESG activities. There's been a huge growth in sustainable investments by that group, and a very large influx into investment funds that now represent about 1/3 of the total US assets under management. I've got a couple of charts behind this that will show you that growth. 90% of global public investors have developed specific investment policies, or they are in development to do that. Now, these activities are actually driven by a number of trends that have been building for the last several years. One, and a very important one, is some shifting social and business attitudes toward the importance of ESG and representing the urgency of need that's involved there. There's been a steady growth of agreement with the principles of stakeholder capitalism. Stakeholder capitalism is the doctrine that says that the purpose and mission of a corporation is no longer strictly directed only at shareholder return, but it says that the long-term growth and success of a company needs to include, in addition to shareholders, concern for several constituencies that are called stakeholders. Their employees, customers, the practices they have that represent activities in the environment, their local communities, and then society at large. In addition, a number of studies over the past decade or so have shown that companies that are incorporating ESG into their business models have actually shown better financial performance than average companies in the S&P 500. There has been increased support from governments and government organizations for, quote, green projects by way either of regulation or fiscal spending, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. Central banks have become involved in this area and in making plans for what their role might be in addressing climate change. Some central banks have actually included climate change as an issue in stress tests that they're either conducting or about to perform. Many banks have developed ESG lines of business and appointed heads of sustainable finance in those areas. And of course, this year, the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the awareness and commitment, especially to social issues and how they could affect the performance of companies. And it has shown the vulnerability of the global financial system to these non-financial risks. And the European Union, as part of their stimulus program, has developed a 750 billion euro program that's going to be oriented toward Green Deal investments. And in fact, they are committing 30% of the funds in that 750 billion euro package toward green projects. Here are two quotations from two of the leading and best known investment gurus, Lawrence Fink, the CEO at BlackRock, and Warren Buffett, both of whom are very strongly in favor of stakeholder capitalism and companies that are incorporating ESG activities into their performance metrics. The two charts on this page I took from the Bank of America website. Bank of America is a very strong advocate of sustainability. And in fact, Brian Moynihan, the CEO at Bank of America, is in charge of one of the leading organizations that's being involved in this. But this shows the evidence of the changing social dynamics and how they're affecting ESG investments. As you can see on the chart on the left, there's a growing influence of women and millennials, especially as participants and investors in ESG activity. And the chart on the right shows that the companies that are focused on ESG activities actually show better performance than the average S&P 500 company. The three lines on this chart all came from three different research firms. Here is one chart that shows the very dramatic growth in ESG investments over the past 15 years, a 456% surge since 2010 alone. And on this chart, we see the percentage of assets under management that are invested in ESG-focused activities as well. It's now about 50% of total assets under management, and that's expected to grow to about 95% of all global assets under management within the next 10 years. So for the remainder of this presentation, this is what we're going to be covering. I'll go through a short history of the major events and organizations that have been involved in ESG. But then I want to get into the follow-up activity to that represents all of the proposed frameworks and proposals and standards that a number of organizations have put into place since the key events of the Paris Accord and others. But that really has led to a current state of overlapping, inconsistent, and fragmented approaches to these standards, to the point where progress to move forward has sort of slowed to a standstill because there really are so many different metrics, frameworks, and proposals that are in play. But there have been some activities this year, a couple of very important papers, for example, that have been produced just in the past few months that represent a breakthrough, I think, in trying to come up with some standardization and consolidation of all of these different proposals that one company has called a pivot point in going forward for that. And then I want to get into what some of the implications are in the sustainable finance area and what that might mean to banks, lenders, and other organizations that are involved in financing these projects. And then we'll close with a few comments about AFS's readiness to support and deal with these expectations. ESG as a term has been around only for a very, very short time, but here are some of the events that really began the whole movement 50 to 60 years ago. You may recall the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson in the early 60s about the dangers of pesticides. In '69, there was the oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara, California, that to this day represents still the largest oil spill off the coast of California. 1970 saw the first Earth Day, and then later in the year, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in the US. 1975 on record is the first use of the term global warming. And global warming really didn't become an active concept for conferences and other issues until the 1990s, when a lot of research and conferences on climate change began to proliferate. The United Nations really has taken the role, a very, very major role in organizing and leading a lot of the conferences and activities and research around environmental issues in particular. They had their first conference in 1972. In 1987, there was a conference that's called the Brundtland Conference, named after the Norwegian Prime Minister, who was the chair of that conference. And that's where the term sustainable development was first introduced and defined. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that definition is still largely intact and upheld by people and organizations since '87. And then in late '88, going into the '90s, we had some UN conferences on climate change. The Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1997, which has been in force since 2005. It closes this year, and that leads us to the Paris Accord, actually. Most of the major activity that is under discussion right now, by the way, it took place post the year 2000. In 2005, we saw the first use of the term ESG. It was in a UN-sponsored study called Who Cares Wins. And it was the first to make the case that putting environmental, social, and governance factors into capital markets made good business sense. In 2015, the UN came out with its Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted under the Program for Sustainable Development. 193 countries agreed to the adoption of those goals. I'm going to show you what they are on the next slide. And while there was a little controversy when they were first proposed about how practicable and realistic they were, they're now widely considered to be the roadmap for the long-term goals of society, and virtually all of the ESG activities by any organization or initiative are really trying to align themselves with these UN Sustainable Development Goals. The Paris Accord, that's considered the premier accord and an initiative around ESG, actually climate change is its focus, was agreed in 2015 by 196 countries, signed, and it went into effect the following year. That came out of a UN conference on climate change. That conference has meetings and activities every year, and this one came out of the 21st session of that conference. And then, as I've mentioned already, in this year, the global pandemic and a lot of social upheaval that resulted in countries around the world, and particularly in the US, has added a lot of focus on the social and governance issues in the ESG umbrella. But I have to mention, because it is very realistic and important, that activities in Europe are leading the way on ESG focuses. Right after the Paris Accord was adopted, the European Commission appointed a number of task forces to get started preparing some blueprints for the reforms and frameworks that would lead them toward a sustainable finance strategy for the EU. And just last year, the EU adopted its so-called Green Deal and agreed to include it in their economic recovery program. There's a trillion euro budget for that. And as I've mentioned, 30% of those funds are committed to be spent only on projects that meet green criteria. And those criteria are being developed by way of what's called the EU taxonomy, which was just adopted earlier this year. The EU taxonomy is a classification system that defines and quantifies what stages are necessary to achieve the Paris Accord objectives. It gets into some very detailed definitions and standards and metrics for what really is going to constitute progress toward the Paris Accord. It calls itself a tool for transition. Having trouble moving the slide here. There we go. Here are the 17 sustainability development goals that I mentioned that were adopted by the EU. I put this here to show you the quite a large breadth and scope of these 17 goals. They include alleviating poverty and hunger, increasing better education, reducing inequality, increasing gender equality, etc. And they're all aiming, while these are broad and large goals in scope, they're all aiming for achievement or at least very substantial progress by the year 2030. Now, the Paris Accord also has some intermediate important goals that are set for the same 2030 timeline, which is what makes all of this so very urgent. I should point out, too, that there is no hard enforcement mechanism in either these sustainability development goals or the Paris Accord, however. Involvement and participation by countries is still voluntary and on a best effort basis. So after once these very large and broad goals have been put forward, then this is when various organizations and initiatives started coming forward, probably in the past 15 years or so, to take this one step further. Their effort is to define and develop ways to support these goals and to come up with the various frameworks, metrics, standards, definitions, etc., to try to make them realistic and attainable. So the focus now has shifted from very high-level goals to how they're going to be achieved. And they're really efforts to address the hard questions, such as what really is material, for example, to achieve the Paris Accord goals? What topics should be addressed? How are they defined? How do you quantify them? How do you measure them? How do you try to standardize those objectives? How do we get companies, for example, to disclose the activities that they're involved in that are affecting ESG? How do we determine comparability among a number of different standards that really to this point are just subjective? How do you put metrics around them? What really is meaningful in terms of progress and impact toward these goals? And what separates them from greenwashing? Greenwashing, by the way, represents a proposal or claim from companies or others that they have something of significant ESG impact, but in fact, it really turns out not to be so. So what are the right impact thresholds that should be in place to qualify as a green project? And then one of the really critical questions here that's problematic for all of this activity is how do we translate and correlate ESG data into an economic impact? How do you take the removal of air pollution, for example, from the atmosphere, and how do you correlate that to a financial impact that investors would want to know about for making decisions on their part? Here are some of the representative organizations and initiatives that have been developed in the past 15 years or so, really just to show you the breadth and scope of activity that's taken place. All of these have sprung up since the year 2000 or so. Each of them has its own objectives, interests, value sets, material standards, priorities, etc. Some of them are focused on carbon data disclosures. Others are coming up with suggestions and methods to translate into the financial impact on the performance of companies. Others just have suggestions about disclosure. Some are involved in the role of central banks. Ratings, for example, over the past 5 or 6 years, a number of firms have developed their own rating systems to try to incorporate a quantitative numerical value or score in ESG that can be used by potential investors. They've independently, however, developed their own methodologies, frameworks, classifications, and other systems. And because they are non-standardized and inconsistent, they really are of only subjective value to investors and others that are trying to apply them to due diligence efforts. I should point out that much of the work done by any of these groups still remains couched in relatively broad, non-specific terms, which is what makes reporting still difficult to correlate and measure for those that are seeking it. And that brings us to the current state. So as you may surmise, this proliferation of organizations and proposals has led to the state of fragmentation among them all. To use a homely analogy, there are a lot of cooks in the ESG kitchen, and that has created a situation where forward progress has slowed significantly. They're all very, very well intentioned, of course, but the critical issue is that the information about ESG activity is essentially subjective in nature. It's qualitative, not readily translatable to monetary terms, difficult to quantify, and very, very difficult to verify and compare one issue to another. How, for example, do you compare the relative value of educating a girl in a developing country to removing a ton of air pollution? Sustainability disclosure is much more complex than financial reporting. And the critical issue really is the subjective nature of it, as I just mentioned. And while it's very, very important to coordinate these initiatives and events, perhaps above all else, as far as investment is concerned, the remaining gaps and challenges in all of this work concern data. Investors want more detail in ESG information. They want more disclosure from companies. They want more specificity in what's really important and how to measure it. So we have a number of areas in which further work on data development is really going to be really important in the next intermediate term. How to define this activity, how to standardize it, how to collect the information, how to incentivize companies to reveal more disclosure about them. How do you analyze all of this data? And then finally, how do you correlate it? How do you make it relevant, in other words, to the user? So data has become really the core issue that's involved in all of this, which brings us to this slide, which I think is really a very, very important one, because it talks about the role of data across this, what I call a spectrum of data, where you have producers on the left-hand side of the chart, primarily the companies that are involved in disclosing their ESG-related information, all the way to toward the right to the aggregators of this information, and then finally to users on the right, who are the ones that are ingesting this ESG data and making lending or investment decisions. I've added in red the names or descriptions of some of the companies and organizations that would be involved in various aspects of this, where you have corporations that are disclosing and producing the information. And then you have firms like S&P Global, IHS Markit, Sustainalytics, Realfinitiv, that are the ones that are aggregating and providing the databases of this ESG information. You've got Fitch, Moody's, and various others that are doing ratings and analytics for it. And then, among the end users is where I put lenders, AFS clients, and other banks that are going to be lending to ESG-related projects in among all of the other users of that information. The frameworks and standards box in the middle is where the definitions, materiality topics, disclosure requirements, and detailed standards on an industry by industry basis, most likely, will need to be made consistent for all of these segments, so that they're logical, understandable, and relevant across all of these participants. Having a common set of standards is what will achieve widespread legitimacy and usage, much like the financial reporting standards and requirements in use today. Structured information enables greater connectivity among the producers and users of data. It allows for information to be easily searched, filtered, aggregated, and finally integrated into end user technologies. Now, it's exactly the development of these common and standardized frameworks that's the objective of the many organizations and initiatives I've been discussing. And a number of signs have started to appear, especially this year, that hopefully can move this effort forward. As I may have mentioned, we've had a groundswell of social change and awareness of the urgency of ESG issues over the past number of years. That's been growing quite a lot, and as I mentioned, it was greatly accelerated by COVID-19. But there are two recent events that took place just within the past few months that have stood out as important developments. In September of this year, there was a coalition that was led by Bank of America, the World Environmental Forum, the World Economic Forum, I'm sorry, and an organization called the IBC, the International Business Council. Brian Moynihan, the CEO of Bank of America, is the chair of the IBC. And together with several of the top accounting firms, they issued in September a very significant paper called Measuring Stakeholder Capitalism that proposes putting together a framework for a lot of these global ESG standards, what they did in the course of their work was to take many of the proposals and papers that have been developed by other organizations with proposed standards, metrics, etc., and has tried to consolidate those into a single, common, universal framework that would coalesce a lot of the work that's been done already. They developed 21 core proposals and an additional 34 expanded ones, and grouped them into 4 pillars that are aligned directly with the UN Sustainability Development Goals and other principal ESG areas. These 4 pillars cover what are called principles of government, the planet, the environment, people, and prosperity. And then at the same time as this paper was developed, 5 of the leading framework and standard setters who have been developing a lot of these frameworks I've mentioned issued another paper that committed themselves to collaborate on developing a standardized framework for corporations to use and to develop a set of these metrics that they would like corporations to disclose in their mainstream disclosures, such as annual reports and proxy statements. The paper that they produced in September put forward a number of very detailed principles for integrating a lot of this work. And by very detailed, I mean they got really down to the level of how should you measure what's important for threshold, what's important for impact, exactly what information should be disclosed industry by industry in terms of their impact on the environment, social issues, corporate governance issues, and so forth. And so they developed a number of principles that they're proposing for how this information should be gathered, put together, and then reported, including making sure that their standards are connected among all of the participants that are likely involved across that whole data spectrum. There needs to be a private-public partnership for financing a lot of this activity, making sure that all the stakeholders are engaged in getting involved in it, and then finally making sure that it recognizes the leading role of European areas that are involved in it as well. So then what does all of this mean eventually to investors, lenders, and others in the sustainable finance area? Sustainable finance has been transitioning over the past several years from what was called socially responsible investing. That SRI activity was really based on moral imperatives rather than any other criteria. The basic message under socially responsible investing was do not invest in companies that do harm. Don't invest in coal producing companies. Don't invest in tobacco companies and so forth. And that has transitioned over the past several years, again, based on a lot of reports about the financial performance of such companies, into criteria that says these sorts of investments make good financial sense. There are a number of financial products in place already that have grown up in the past decade or so. Green bonds and loans. Green bonds and loans say that the proceeds for those projects can be invested in certain well-defined projects that are included in a catalog of available and important areas in order to invest. Sustainability-linked loans came along a little bit after green bonds and loans. They are a little more flexible in how the proceeds can be used. In effect, a sustainability-linked loan has a pricing incentive for companies that are involved in them that says if the lender and the borrower can agree on a mutual set, can mutually agree on a set of objectives that they would like the borrower to improve upon in their ESG activity, if the borrower can meet those objectives, despite how they use the proceeds of the loan, if they can meet those objectives, then there's a pricing benefit that they could realize. by doing so. Now, since the data standards that I've talked about are still very much in flux and inconsistent, financial institutions and investors still need to develop their strategies for approaching ESG projects by addressing a number of the questions that are involved here. They are going to need to do that because there still are not any standards. The ESG reporting is still quite immature, and it's still premature to expect any specific or required metrics for lenders and other institutions to be able to adopt. So until such time as any common standards and prescribed metrics become available for lenders in their ESG due diligence, they're going to have to determine the data they want to incorporate based on their own ESG strategies and credit policies for any given proposition or project. And where data is concerned, especially around what data they are going to want to collect, the key issues that are going to be addressing these banks has to be based on flexibility and agility. So for the time being, customizable and configurable data fields, for example, will be very, very useful for storage and servicing systems that are affected. I want to show you finally a couple of charts that show the levels of sustainability specific products and their growth and opportunity ahead. This one shows the very rapid growth of green loans and bonds and sustainability linked loans and bonds, which are more recent products. Green bonds and sustainability linked loans have become the most prevalent and fastest growing products, as you can see here. And this chart shows the current levels of green and sustainable commercial loans at the banks in the AFS Business Intelligence Database as a percentage of their total commercial outstanding volumes. We look at this chart optimistically and see that where levels are broadly in the 2 to 4% range, while the market average is under 3%, there is plenty of potential still for growth going forward in sustainable lending. And with that, I'll turn things back to Dean for some final comments on AFS's readiness to handle the expectations for ESG lending and loan servicing. Dean?
Thank you, Lee. Appreciate all the helpful information. And again, if you have questions, you can submit those now. As we move forward and with this and our support here at AFS, we know that our AFS Vision platform contains the framework to support the ESG lending issues, having a straight through process for data lineage and data integrity, of course. I don't know how many times Lee used the word data when talking about ESG lending, and not just the data itself about the deals, but the metrics around originating and boarding deals that can all be tracked within AFS. So the flexibility for data fields, AFS recently introduced in AFS Vision a new ability to in real time create data fields that automatically populate on screens and workflows in data reporting database on our reports, and unlimited ability to define new data fields. It's going to be very important in new areas like ESG. And of course, having the data around all aspects of the borrower, whether it's just the loans, the commitments, certainly the collateral and risk ratings and guarantees, being able to have all that data in one place, as we like to say, a single version of the truth, right? You're not trying to bring data from different systems, bring it together and match it up with Vision. That becomes your single source to be the official record for that data. And certainly from there, we will see reporting, the dashboards and so forth evolving out of that, based on the data that's resident within within AFS Vision. And as Lee mentioned at the end, we showed a chart of some of the data we have from our business intelligence group here at AFS, where we're tracking and monitoring real live loan data from major lenders across the country, over $1 trillion of commitments now being tracked in that database. And we certainly have some upcoming webinars in January. We'll be continuing to drill down on that data. So speaking of upcoming events, very important one, January 20th, we're going to be having our next webinar on LIBOR cessation or SOFR, certainly digesting the most recent news last week about the extension of the deadline for the end of LIBOR. We've sent out a survey to our banks, and so on January 20th, we'll be sharing the results. If you haven't gotten the survey, you're interested in contributing, please contact us and we can provide you a copy. It only takes a few minutes to fill out, but the information will be very meaningful, I think. Also, January 28th, in conjunction with the RMA, AFS will be having our regular risk analysis service webinar, providing the latest in risk data across the industry. And on February 4th, we will be providing our pricing fundamentals update, which is the year in review for 2020, to look at the commercial lending landscape in terms of pricing and directions there. So as you can see, we've got some exciting topics coming up. We'll be scheduling a follow-up to today's topic on ESG. And certainly you should know there's many ways to stay on top of all the latest news from AFS between our website, Twitter, Facebook, so forth, Instagram. We are all over the social media front. So Renee, I'm going to ask you if there's any questions as we wrap up today that Lee might be able to entertain.
We did have one question that came in regards to the ESG history, Lee. And the question was, what about the Millennium Development Goals of 2000?
As I mentioned toward the beginning, I was focused more on the reporting and other developments and challenges associated with that. ESG really is a huge field, and if I've missed any of the initiatives that people think I should have covered in that history, I do apologize. I purposely made it a very brief review of the history. And if there's a specific question about the Millennium Goals, I'd be more than happy to look into it and get back to the asker of that question.
Thanks, Lee. And at this point, we don't have any other questions. I will remind everyone we will be sending a follow-up email tomorrow with a link so that you may listen to this webinar. As well as you can download the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. We hope you found this to be beneficial today. We'll look forward to 2021 for more sessions. And on behalf of AFS, we'd like to wish everyone a happy, healthy, and safe holiday season. Thank you.
Thank you.